Hello, loyal viewers. This is An American Thinks, and we're back again with a new episode of The Grand Theory of Everything. So in episode 6, we took a break from in-world character analysis to step back and analyze our author, particularly his formative years during the Vietnam War era, as well as the cultural and social issues that were prevalent during that time. In short, the former generation, who were the parents of Martin's generation and had won the World War, viewed military service as a civic duty, while protesters of Martin's era resented the overbearing nature of the Great Generation and viewed the war as cruel and unjust. A superpower asserting military dominance over a poorer people with far less ability to defend themselves. This history has formed settings and themes that Martin has written about over and over. In fact, I would go so far as to say that if this is not the foremost theme in his writing, then it is certainly in the top 3. We also talked about Weirwoods and how group consciousness could offer a solution to the limitations posed by our individuality, those limitations being that we struggle to understand other individuals, particularly those who are different to us. Obviously, the great benefit of joining a collective consciousness is that all the individuals within the consciousness know what all the other individuals in the consciousness are feeling at all times. Honestly, we really shouldn't even be using the term individual when describing this because the individual effectively no longer exists. There is simply the collective. On that note, I think there is one thing worth pointing out here that provides specific context to our discussion. Joining a group consciousness is something that is specifically different than simply having telepathic capability. We know that George R. R. Martin writes a lot about telepathy. For example, Bran and Varamir Sixskins have telepathic abilities in the Song of Ice and Fire, and Robb and Lyanna have telepathic abilities in A Song for Leah, discussed in our last episode. But even though telepaths have the ability to read the minds or feel the feelings of others, they still remain individuals and work in their own individual interests. Notably, in A Song for Leah, Robb chooses not to join the group consciousness, even though he has telepathically felt the effects of the consciousness. Bran has experienced the effects of the Weirwood in the Cave of the Three-Eyed Crow, but he remains an individual, and presumably, he won't join the group consciousness either, unless his story is about to become a very, very different type of story. Now, having summarized all this, while I think George R. R. Martin has highlighted the bright points of collective consciousness, I also think he hits at some of the drawbacks as well. There has been no shortage of people who have suggested that the group consciousness is simply a great farce, that the collective has learned how to trigger a dopamine response or something similar in the individual to entice them to join the consciousness. But in reality, the collective is simply using individuals for some other nefarious reason, like the machines in the Matrix or a similar concept. And while this is a possibility, and I couldn't speak for every collective consciousness that Martin has written about because The Thousand Worlds has multiple examples, I personally don't think there is strong evidence that this applies to the Weirwoods. We have POV evidence of a character experiencing the Weirwoods, and at least in this example, the Weirwoods don't appear to work this way. I have heard other fans who view the Weirwoods as a proxy for a religious experience, and I admit a lot of the similar themes are there. There's themes of empathy, love for others, eternal life, so on. And while I agree that these similarities exist, I'm not sure that I agree that this is the function that Weirwoods serve for our story. For an atheist such as our author, religious belief is rejected due to a lack of observable evidence. And this is not the case whatsoever with the Weirwoods, since we have POV evidence that Weirwoods do, in fact, exist, and they do, in fact, work. We may not entirely understand how they work, but they absolutely do work. But there are 2 unanswered points about the Weirwoods, and the greater concept of collective consciousness in general, that we really need to address before moving on with the analysis of our overall literary theme. First of all, while we put a lot of analysis into the concept of collective consciousness and how it affects individuals that have been absorbed into the consciousness, we haven't really talked a lot about how collective consciousness interacts with individuals outside the consciousness. Obviously, in A Song for Leah, we read about Robb's interaction with Leah after she joins the consciousness, and it is essentially in the form of an emotional appeal. Other than the emotional component, the interaction is pretty benign. However, this isn't true of all group consciousnesses that George R. R. Martin has written about. For example, in Men of Greywater Station, the group consciousness is much more malevolent towards the human individuals in the story. In Guardians, the Mudpots were supposedly a peace-loving group consciousness, but began to defend themselves, or itself, after being pressured by human colonization. And we don't have an example in any of George R. R. Martin's work about what would happen if two different collective consciousnesses encountered each other. For example, what if the fungus from the Men of Greywater Station encountered the Grishka? Would they choose to somehow merge into one giant new consciousness? Would that even be biologically possible? Or would they compete for the consciousness of the individuals caught within the two superpower consciousness entities? In short, while I do think that group consciousness tends to equate to peace and love within the consciousness entity, I don't think that this is necessarily the case for all individuals who encounter the entity. It is only for those who join it. And the second point to consider is the cost of joining the entity. The supposed benefit is the ability to experience eternal love, joy, and peace. But the cost is that you have to give up your individuality. And while the benefits are expressed very explicitly in stories like A Song for Leah, the costs are not explicit and have to be inferred. For example, neither the Grishka nor the Weirwoods produce any art. They have no books, no cinema. There's no Eiffel Tower, no pyramids, no Angkor Wat. The individuals who have grown around them, namely the Shkeen in A Song for Leah and the Children of the Forest in A Song of Ice and Fire, do not develop any technology beyond what is necessary to survive long enough to join the group consciousness. They too have no Starry Night or Birth of Venus, no Gone with the Wind or Star Wars, no Beethoven or Whitney Houston, nothing remotely like what modern science has accomplished for medicine or genetic research or archaeology. They simply aren't interested. So on the one hand, collective consciousness removes the barriers of struggling to understand and trust other individuals, but at the same time, it removes all the many varied and amazing and wonderful things that individuals have accomplished because we are each different from each other. It is simply an eternal consciousness sitting there, feeling good, but doing nothing. At this point, you might be feeling that this is all a big letdown, that we have been building to something only to see it turn into a straw man that we can in turn beat into nothing. But that's not exactly true. I think we are building to something, both in this theory series and in A Song of Ice and Fire. I think the fundamental, underlying theme of the series is not that group consciousness is the ultimate solution to our shortcomings. I don't think George R. R. Martin is writing the series with the intent to encourage readers to give up our individuality. I think what he wants to impress upon us is that we need to choose to love other people, even if they are different from us. Not because there is a promise of some eternal reward, not because we understand them, and not because they will love us back, and certainly not because it is easy, but we have to choose to love them because it is good, both for them and for ourselves. It is the only way to break the cycle of constant struggle in trying to overcome each other, while still maintaining our individuality. And now we come full circle to where we started last episode, with the Vietnam War and George R. R. Martin's formative years. This concept of sharing universal love would become one of the tenets of the hippie culture at the time, and widely upheld by those resisting the war effort. In retrospect, it is typically looked at as a central part of the zeitgeist of the era. It certainly isn't exclusive to George R. R. Martin. Take, for example, this song, written by Hal David and Burt Bacharach in 1965, near the beginning of U.S. involvement in the war. Or for another example, this scene from A River Runs Through It, which is taken from the book published in 1976, the same year George R. R. Martin published A Song for Leah.
Is not wanted. And so it is those we live with and should know who elude us. but we can still love them. We can love completely without complete understanding.
While understanding the personal ethos of our author may be a different type of literary analysis than analyzing characters in the story, I think it is a crucial point to understand in order to properly analyze the plot points of A Song of Ice and Fire, both with the intent to interpret events that have already happened, and also with the intent to predict how the story will end. And the reason I say that is because I firmly believe that George R. R. Martin has not, and most likely will not, write a story where the protagonists conquer the villains. It is fundamentally not how he views the world. It is fundamentally not the kinds of stories he tells. For example, I'm guessing most readers accept the typical story of the pact between the children and the first men, that at first they made war against each other, and then they were able to reach a peace agreement. And then, interestingly enough, the first men began to adopt the religion of the children. This is our first example of people achieving peace through being able to accept each other rather than conquering each other. But I think it applies to other stories as well. For example, the story of the Long Night that has passed to present time in Westeros is that of a great conflict between the first men and the others, and that a hero found the children of the forest and found a way to defeat the others. However, I don't believe this rendition accurately reflects what truly happened. It is most likely a tale that has been bastardized by thousands of years of human storytelling. In the ethos of George R. R. Martin, violence and conflict only begets more violence and conflict. It does not result in peace lasting for thousands of years. I don't believe the story of the Long Night is a story about discovering dragonglass or discovering how to forge a magical sword at the expense of a spouse. I believe the Long Night was ended when the last hero found the children of the forest, and much in the same way that the events leading up to the pact allowed the children and the first men to accept each other and come to peace, the last hero, and whoever his companions were also able to come to accept the others, and that the two sides were able to come to peace. The battle for the Dawn wasn't a battle fought on a battlefield, but rather, as George R. R. Martin likes to say, it was fought within the human heart, and victory was obtained because the heroes found a way to love and accept their opponents. And in the same vein, I don't believe A Song of Ice and Fire is going to be a story about how dragon people defeated ice people, or about how Jon and Dany create a genetic super baby, or about how Dawn actually becomes Lightbringer, or any of that. It's simply not going to be a story about how one group of people beat another group of people. And now, having discussed our theme, I'm going to start building up to how I think the story will end. But first, since this is my grand theory of everything, I'm going to talk about how the story started, including how George R. R. Martin inadvertently predicted an actual scientific discovery. Thank you all for watching. We'll see you next time.